Our role model today is Stefanie O'Connell, and we are going to talk all about ambition, money, power, work, women in the workplace, because Stefanie, you are a writer and speaker covering those subjects. You are also the host of the Real Simple magazine's Money Confidential podcast. You're a Webby Award honoree, and you're the real go-to expert on work and money. You appear in all the big sort of newspapers, from the Wall Street Journal to the Today Show to the New York Times to you name it, and you're in it. And you produce content about those important topics. You're also the author of The Ambition Penalty, a data-driven guide to overcoming the hidden forces that hold women back, burn them out, and make us all pay. So, Stefanie, thank you. Lovely to have you here to role model at WeCan. Tell us about the ambition penalty. What is it, and why did you feel compelled to write about it?
Sure. So thank you for having me. I'm very excited to talk about the ambition penalty. Basically, my conception of this book really came up from my reporting on women, work, money, all of those things that you talked about that I've been doing for over a decade now. And what I saw constantly was this narrative that women were still not being paid the same as their male counterparts because they weren't asking for more, or they weren't confident enough, or they weren't power posing, or they had too many exclamation points in their emails. There was so many of these ideas about what really holds women back that I constantly kept coming across research that really just did not bear out the message of those narratives. And this idea that, well, the problem is women's ambition or their lack of confidence or their inability to take risks. It's just not true. Women are just as likely to ask for more. They are confident. They do take risks. What is different is that women are more likely to be penalized for asking, for taking those risks, for asserting themselves and having that kind of confidence. And it's this backlash against women's behavior and the subsequent costs of that backlash that men do not experience that really drives these gender gaps in pay, in leadership, in power. And that's what the ambition penalty really works to articulate, to quantify, and to expose.
Stefanie, so give us some of that data. It's a book that's data driven, which is great because these are facts, right? We're not sort of selling lies to people or turning things around. These are just numbers, and those numbers speak for themselves. So give us some of those numbers.
Sure. So, I'm based here in the United States, but a lot of what I write about is global. So, anytime
Mm,
I'm sharing a stat that it's a US stat, it's typically, especially in a Western context like the UK, also extremely similar. So, for example, here in the United States, when you look at the gender pay gap between those who are working full time year round, it grew in 2024 for the second year in a row, returning to where it was in 2005, which is 20 years ago. Now, for context, that's the year after I graduated high school. And now I'm 39 years old. So I'm very squarely in the middle of the millennial generation of women who is now coming into their peak earnings years after a lifetime of being exposed to this idea of all we need to do is be more confident and be empowered to get ahead. And where are we? We're collectively no better off than when we started our careers 20 years ago, even as women are continually now more educated and more ambitious than ever. In fact, we're backsliding in many ways. We saw that for the third year in a row, women being hired into leadership positions, the rate of that fell across the globe. We're seeing that funding for women-led businesses is in decline. We're seeing here in the United States, and again, these are global trends, real attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives that don't just hurt women, but especially disproportionately target the already most marginalized among us. And it's these kinds of outcomes that are set against the backdrop of our upbringing in the peak of this like girl power movement and initiatives that I think really got me thinking about, okay, what's really going on here?
Mm.
How did we get to this point? And that's where I have really come to find that like there is this disconnect between the story we've been sold and these outcomes that I just mentioned.
Stephanie, so are there any industries that are worse than others? Like, is there any sort of ranking system that you have? And I understand this hustle culture, right? That we were sold that if we worked harder, if we were more confident, if we took more risk, etc., we would get there. And really, this girl bossing, hasn't helped, and we're right back where we were. And women feel disillusioned, right?
Correct.
And women are leaving the workplace at different points, but definitely in sort of midlife when the sort of reality hits that this is just, yeah, it burns you out.
It does. And what I like to do is make sure that when we talk about the fact that women are statistically more burnt out than men, this has nothing to do with being a woman. It has nothing to do with some kind of biological thing or like unique kind of preference. It is a result, a direct result of discrimination and bias that is designed to exhaust us. So I think it's always important that we contextualize women's higher rates of burnout not as something that is spontaneously occurring, but is the direct result of these kinds of inequitable systems of power that subject to women to far more stressors, far more higher rates of overwork between paid and unpaid labor, and
Mm.
far less access to resources and meaningful supports like a partner at home who shares in caretaking labor, for example, or support from a mentor or boss in the workplace, which women are statistically much less likely to have access to.
Stephanie, so what do you feel are sort of solutions? You've looked at this problem, you've got all the data to underpin and show us the picture of where we are today. What are possible steps to
Mm.
walk into the right direction?
Well, I think the number one thing that I'm really trying to illustrate here is how much that we perceive. Let me restart that. I think the really big problem that's happening today is that we have misidentified the real barriers to women's advancement. And so, what happens when you believe that the greatest barrier to women getting ahead and getting more of what they want is themselves, their competence, their
Mm.
ambition, something internal, then all of the solutions become focused on what's wrong with women
Yeah.
instead of saying, what is wrong with the environment that penalizes women for the same behavior that is rewarded in their male peers? What is wrong with a system that subjects women to disproportionate levels of burnout? What is wrong with policies that do not provide women with the same supports they need to combine personal and professional lives in the
Mm.
same ways that men get to? And so that is the number one thing I really want people to walk away from is reframing this from an individual internal thing to something that is happening in interaction with the environment around us. And the other thing we can realize when we externalize this, when we contextualize what is happening within the context of the data in the environment, is that what we start to see is that these are not individual problems. These
Mm.
are collective problems. These are shared experiences. And it's really easy for us when we're in this individualistic mindset to internalize the backlash we do experience when we speak up as something we did wrong. We must not have asked right. And this is reinforced through the culture. They say, oh, well, you must have not just done it right, or you must have been too aggressive, or you must have been wearing the wrong clothes or using the wrong punctuation. We are so set up to understand this as a personal failing instead of recognizing that this is a broadly shared experience. And so a collective problem like this also requires a collective solution, not an individual solution. I'm not saying we should abandon the best practices we know of for getting ahead and getting more of what we want in the workplace, in the home, or anywhere else. But I am saying I think we have reached the limits of their effectiveness and where they can take us. And if we want to go somewhere else, if we want to break through this place where we've kind of been stalled out for decades now, we are going to have to start thinking collectively instead of individually. And so what does that look like? It looks like changing the environments that are subjecting women to this kind of backlash, to these kinds of penalties. So, for example, in places where pay transparency policies have been implemented, women face far smaller gender pay gaps relative to their male peers and relative to those places that do not have pay transparency policies. There's nothing about that that's saying like you have to pay a woman this, or pay a man this. It is just a form of accountability. And when we bring accountability and transparency to systems, we see these kinds of inequities really start to fade away. And so I think it's really important that we look at these kinds of policies that are proven to do that. So that's one example. Here in the United States, I'm not as sure how much this is international. Unions use collective bargaining to do the same things that we're effectively talking about on an individual level when we're talking about negotiation. And unions are incredibly effective at not just enabling people to earn more over the course of their lifetimes, but also in closing gender pay gaps and racial pay gaps. They also improve attitudes. They change norms about what power should look like and who is allowed to access it. So again, I think it's a really good textbook example of moving from an individual thing to a collective thing. Of course, policies on a beyond the institutional level, when we're talking about political, social, cultural, this is things like parental leave policies, and not only making sure they're implemented, but making sure that they are utilized. A lot of the times we talk about the fact that if men have paternity leave, they often will not take it. And people will say, there's a lot of backlash against men if they take this leave because there is a flexibility stigma. But we pretend like men are the only ones who are going to face backlash in the workplace. And we say, instead of men having to suffer these penalties, what we're going to do is shift the full cost onto women instead. And that way, the system that subjects anyone to backlash who doesn't conform with hustle culture can stay in place. Instead of saying, hey, if more men take this leave, and yes, they may suffer some penalties in the workplace, but if those penalties are more equitably shared, it will force a confrontation with the system itself, because it cannot continue to go on reinforcing itself if everyone is being disadvantaged by those costs. And so I think, again, that's even a really good example of something that may feel like an individual decision. Am I going to take this leave? Am I not going to take this leave? But when we recontextualize what it means within the broader power structures, does this decision help support or disrupt the status quo? That gives us a real opportunity to impact meaningful cultural and political and institutional change that enables more equitable outcomes.
Yeah, Stefanie, and you outline how much work there is still to be done. And it's really all about being hard on systems and soft on people rather than the other way around, which it often is now. Stefanie, I'm wondering, I've had a lot of chats lately with people in industries like the finance industry that say, no, it's all the other way around now. They are forced to hire a lot of women. These women cost more than men. Um, and I'm sort of wondering what you have to say to that.
It's simply not borne out in the data in any meaningful way. This is a global phenomenon. Women are underpaid in every country in the world. Women do more unpaid labor in every country in the world. They are more subject to bias, harassment, and abuse relative to their male counterparts in every country in the world. There have been some interventions, and those, by any metric, do not even come close to creating a level playing field. I'm saying, sure, they sometimes enable something closer to it, but not even by any stretch of like the imagination are we anywhere near something that is remotely statistically equitable. And one of the things that I write about in my book, The Ambition Penalty, is this myth of meritocracy, this idea that everything is really about rewards flowing to those who deserve them and who produce the most and who really, are contributing the most, whether that's like by hours worked, whether that's by outcomes like sales. And what people who make these kinds of arguments will often say is that, if you try to implement some kind of system like a quota system or a diversity initiative, then you are disrupting that model of meritocracy. But that, again, is not borne out in the data at all. All of the data suggests that identity is the thing that drives rewards in the workplace, but it's not underrepresented identities. It's not marginalized identities. It is overwhelmingly male identity, white male, cis, straight, able-bodied, especially male identity in the workplace that disproportionately drives rewards. And you see a disconnect between performance and rewards, most especially among this demographic, where these men are consistently underperforming their women counterparts or even their counterparts across other forms of marginalized identities. And yet these men are more likely to be promoted. They're more likely to be paid more. They're more likely to hold leadership positions. So the meritocracy is, quite frankly, a myth. And one of the things I also break down is how that myth continues to be maintained, even as you have more women who are more qualified and more educated coming into the workforce than ever. And what happens is, what the workplace effectively does is shifts the markers of what counts as merit worthy. So what I mean by that is we redefine meritocracy to maintain our existing systems of power, as opposed to using the metrics that we've always used to say, okay, this is what's important for getting ahead, or this is how we measure success, to say, oh, the kinds of people who are creating that success now look differently and we should reward them more accordingly. Instead of doing that, what they do is say, oh, actually now like sales don't matter so much, let's say. They'll say, oh, no. Really, it's about personality. It's about fit. And that way, you can effectively maintain the same discriminatory systems, even as you have a woman or person of color or someone else objectively outperforming the metrics that we have previously used to measure meritocracy. And we have this very, very well documented in the research. I break it down quite a bit in the book, including what Professor Emilio Castillo has studied, something called the paradox of meritocracy, where the more an organization thinks of itself as meritocratic, the more likely it is to demonstrate bias against women.
Stefanie, so this book is coming out next year in 2026, right?
Correct. That's right.
So what would you say to girls and women entering the workplaces now? What tips can we give them?
I want women to be prepared for what they're going to face.
Mm.
There is a lot about this book that I recognize can feel incredibly difficult to reckon with. It is eye-opening, the data about how bad gender discrimination and gender inequality and all forms of inequality still remain in the world. And it's painful. It's painful to reckon with that. But it is much more painful to deal with the consequences of that while being gaslit that it's not happening.
Totally.
And so what I want this book to do is validate everyone who is actively living this reality day to day and find community with one another. Because we have been gaslit for so long about what is actually happening, again, we have been siloed into these like separate factions of like, oh, well, it's really just your choice because you chose to not pursue this kind of degree or this kind of field or engage in this way after you became a parent. And that is a distraction from the fact that these systems are working to make you feel like this is your fault, even as they are actively the ones creating these unequal outcomes. And so if you can start to recognize these experiences, not as individual, but as shared, and work in community with other women who are awakening to that same realization, you will be much more effective in creating these kinds of collective challenges to systems of power. It is really hard to stand up against a system of power and the status quo when you are alone. It is much, much more effective, as we know, as I said, from evidence from unions, for example, from protest movements, from history, when you do it together.
Stephanie, so tell us about your journey. How did you get into these topics? Ambition, power, money, topics that we as women are more reticent to sort of discuss and identify with.
I started initially writing about money from a place of just having a lot of financial anxiety. Like a
Mm,
lot of people, I personally graduated college in 2008. So it was the year of the great financial
crush.
crisis. And that was a time that didn't just have this kind of like huge disruption in terms of like the stock market.
Mm,
There was also a big redefining of what work looked like during that time. And now we all kind of know it as our new normal. But like the narrative really was growing up that you get a job, you have it for 40 years, you get these incremental pay raises, and one day you retire. And then all of a sudden, not only does no one I know have a job, but suddenly the jobs that are available are like these new gig work things. This
mm,
is like pre-smartphone even, and I'm not that old, but this is we're still talking about a very different reality. And the shifting landscape meant that a lot of my colleagues didn't have access to, certainly not pensions, but not even what we have in the United States, a 401k, like a retirement
yeah.
savings plan through an employer.
Mm,
And so it was like, well, none of the advice really applies to me because this is not what my life looks like. And so I became obsessed with money because I just wanted to understand it. And I wanted to understand what was not only happening for myself, but so much of my peers, and how this kind of like evolving work world and an evolving financial world really intersected with financial planning more broadly, and what it is we need to do to create some sense of stability and work towards the things we want. And the more I got into that world and wrote and reported, the more I started to see how much this intersects with much bigger things like identity and politics and culture, and how much those forces are actually some of the biggest drivers of financial outcomes as opposed to anything we do ourselves. Now, this is not to say like I don't think there's things we can do. There are things we can do, but there are limits on the effectiveness when you are talking about places where you can go bankrupt with a medical bill or from going
mm,
to college. And so, or these days with climate change, a lot of people, their biggest asset is their home.
yeah.
And people are losing homes to natural disasters. So I became so interested in how the world, the broader world, and the systems around the systems we all live in
Yeah.
really are the greatest influence on our financial lives, and then consequently, our work lives, the things we want, the lives, how we want to construct the lives we lead, both at home and in the workplace. And that's how I broaden out the scope of what I was writing about and reporting on to understand, how did that shape the trajectory of our lives, and how did that differ across identity, and why was it still happening when we had been told that, well, all of this has been solved and it's now a level playing field, and clearly that's not the case.
I get this all the time, Stephanie. Why are you doing what you're doing? Everything is fine now.
Mm.
What does success look like for you? Do you feel that you've really achieved this life that you imagined for yourself?
In many ways, I am living my dream. But I think a lot of that success, to be fair, has been enabled through a lot of luck, a lot of privilege. Like I'm a white woman in the United States.
Yeah.
Sure, I am subject to some gender discrimination, but I didn't grow up in poverty. I grew up with the privileges of having access to excellent public education, living in a town that invested in community programs, was willing to do that stuff. And so I was really set up for success in many ways. And I think the success I have now, as much as I think I do work hard, I don't think I work harder than anyone else.
Yeah.
But I am very pleased with my ability to do the kind of work that I care about. And I had a baby 2 years ago. So I got to do that too. And I really think that's important, that like these weren't things that are mutually exclusive for me just because I'm a woman. But I also know that that is an experience that is still mutually exclusive for too many women, because they do not have the support structures
Yeah.
to enable that. And even for me, with the privileges that I have and the money I saved and the discipline, like I really worked to get ahead of it, it has been incredibly difficult to manage the childcare burdens, the costs, the penalties of becoming a mother on my income and my
Mm.
opportunity. And so I'm not immune, even with all my privileges. And that's one of the things I didn't, I think I had to cut from the book just for word count, but I think there is this diminishing of this issue because the people who often have the most privilege often have the bandwidth, have the time, have the protection to be able to speak up about these things. But then they become discounted, because then it's like, well, why are you complaining? And it gets dismissed as these like overly privileged women asking for too much. And then there becomes this kind of narrative that like, oh, if we can just dismiss what these women are talking about,
Yeah.
then we can dismiss the issues that affect all the women
Mm.
that are also experiencing these in ways that are life constraining, life altering, limit their economic autonomy, their security, their ability to feed their families, their ability to care for their children, their ability to live life with dignity. And I think it's really important that we never diminish these things.
I couldn't agree more, Stephanie, because I think that if we would back each other up all the time and we wouldn't cancel each other out, we would be in a different place now. So this is really my number one point, I think. And you said it earlier, you have to find the community of other women, because in that community, you will find your power and you will find things mirrored back to you that are important for every woman's journey. What do you, yeah.
And I just want to speak to what you said, because it's completely true. And in that community of other women, you will also find people who will have institutional and experiential knowledge that you often do not get in other settings. So, some of the research on those who are able to advance, who are able to access greater economic, personal, professional power, finds that it's women who have both a strong regular workplace professional network and a strong women specific network
Mm.
alongside it, who are far more likely to advance. And it's because that network that you get, that you need to get ahead, as everyone knows, is always be networking, right? That network is important when you have everyone represented. But having that women specific network becomes incredibly important, because that's where you find the people who can really speak to the unique intricacies of the gendered experience that makes, when you ask for more, a different situation than a man who does the same. And I think this is especially true for women across identity. It's important to have this coalition building so we can pass on and relate and work together to kind of challenge those systems that create these different experiences for us across identity, even when we are otherwise implementing the same strategies or practicing the same behaviors.
Yeah. Stephanie, so what makes you feel powerful and aligned?
Mm. What makes me feel powerful? I certainly find myself always again coming back to this idea of community. I will say that I have a real privilege of not just having a community with where I am or the people I grew up with, but I've also found it through the work I do.
Mm.
And that I find is so valuable to me, because the community I've built through my work is the community that I find really sees me as I am and makes me feel the most myself and the most in alignment with the things I want, in ways that I find interesting, because we often talk about like, well, your identity shouldn't be so tied up in work. But work isn't just about what you're doing, it's about another form of community and how you're showing up
Yeah.
in the world and spending a good amount of your time. And there's a reason why, when we're out of paid work, we see higher rates of loneliness, we see higher rates of disconnection, we see well-being go down, because the workplace has many, many benefits beyond just compensation. But what's happening is those benefits are being crowded out by these experiences where the power systems are working to create systems that make it incredibly difficult, exhausting, and hard to just exist in that environment for some people. And that winds up not only disconnecting them from their economic power, but it disconnects them from the benefits of that community and that power that they get from, having that ability to have an identity that exists beyond, especially for me in my season of young motherhood, beyond just one thing, beyond just wife, beyond just mother, beyond just anything. I really think diversity, just like in investing, diversity of identity is one of the most important things. And we often we look down on people if they're overly aligned on one identity marker, but for women, it's almost always the work identity marker that gets cast as a problem. And I actually think that's intentional. I think it's intentional to silo us off from saying, well, this is the only identity that matters for women. And I think that's nonsense. Full identity is what matters. It's not about what makes us a man or woman or whatever. It's about what makes us human. And what makes us human is having this diversity of sources of community, sources of joy, sources of meaning, so that what I have at home is valuable, and what I have in the world is valuable, and what I have in my community is valuable, and what I have in my workplace is all valuable. And so when something inevitably goes wrong in one of those spaces, and it will in all of those spaces at some point, I am not so overly dependent on that one identity that I fall apart.
Yeah. Yeah, you said that very powerfully. And Stephanie, I think as long as we are where we are, where the only question women always get asked on every panel is, how do you do it all? And before we don't ask every man on every panel the same question, I think it's very obvious that we need to change systems. Right? Because it's not just on us. Yes, we are the birthing machines and it's our bodies birthing those children, but it doesn't mean that they're just, we're sort of hip to hip with our children forever and ever. It's two people making those babies. So
that's right. I actually dedicated a whole chapter of my book to this discussion and the idea that having it all is something that is considered only too privileged for women. And men are not ever being asked to choose between having a family and having a career. It is assumed that those two things will go together. And I think the reason it doesn't go together for women, or it's assumed not to go together for women, is because women are expected to do it all. And so the problem here is not an aspiration problem, it's a labor problem.
Yeah.
And women are being given all of the labor and not enough of the support for that to happen. And so this is a real necessary shift of labor so that it's more equitably distributed, and of support systems. And I think the support has to exist on every level. It has to happen interpersonally, in our homes, in our relationships. It has to happen institutionally, in our workplaces, in our organizations, and it has to happen politically, culturally. So in these broader systems. So when I talk about systems, I want to make clear that I'm talking about attacking them on every single level, because I think people can feel like, well, I only vote every, once a year, whenever it is. But this is not the only kind of system where we affect change. There are systems happening at every single layer, from the political and cultural to the institutional and organizational to the interpersonal, that we can always be challenging.
Definitely. Stefanie, so what are your plans and goals? Tell us when exactly this book is coming out, and what else? What is the vision for the next years?
Oh, it's really hard for me to think beyond this book. I'll have to tell you that. I sold this book when I was 9 months pregnant, 8 months pregnant. The book proposal I had written I started writing just when I found out I was pregnant. And then I sold the book, and then they said, okay, how long do you need to finish writing it? And I was like, I don't know. I've never had a baby before. So that was 2 years ago. And the book is now coming out in May
May.
2026. So this has been a long journey for me. And I have to be honest that all of my sights are set on May 2026.
Yeah.
I will have to think bigger, and I will, but I am bandwidth limited by how far ahead I can think.
Yeah. Amazing. Stefanie, so what takeaways would you like our listeners to have from your story?
Well, I really hope that people come back to the idea of power in numbers, power in community, power in solidarity, and then thinking always beyond themselves. Even when we talk about personal choices or individual choices, it's true. Like at the end of the day, everything is going to be different from person to person to person, but always try to contextualize them within the broader status quo, within the broader systems of power. And I think there's always a question and a challenge to ourselves that we can take on too and say, is the choice that I'm making supporting the power system as it is, as inequitable as it is, as problematic as it is, or is it challenging it? And I want us to have a little grace, because the fact is we are all trying to get through these systems as best we can. We are surviving through them. But I want us to be in a place where we can thrive. And thriving will require us to challenge those systems more often. So I think there are times where, as women, as especially women of color, women with disabilities, those across sexual orientation, identity, there are times where we are simply trying to cope with the system. So I'm wearing makeup today, right? I'm adhering to a patriarchal beauty standard. I'm coping with the system. But what I won't do is sit here and try to give a speech about how wearing makeup is empowering. And I think because what that does is it justifies the system, and it reframes what we have to do to get by in an inequitable world as something that's really something powerful or even feminist, when it's just objectively not. And what that effectively does is excuse away these systems of power, rather than either just coping because we have to get by the best we can, or because sorry, I lost my train of thought. But my point here is that I think we need to really differentiate between when is it something that we're just doing to get by versus when is it something that we're really going to try to say, I'm going to do this differently. And if I am doing it just to get by, let me not reframe it as something that it isn't, because that really effectively hurts everybody else.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And this is something that we get lied to all the time, right? And that's where you then become slightly, I'm allergic to it now, because I think it's not serving anybody. Stefanie, and you lead so powerfully with data and facts, and I love it. And you talk about ambition, money, power, the workplace, women in the workplace, such important topics. I want to encourage everyone to look out for the ambition and the ambition penalties coming out in May, but people can pre-order beforehand, and pre-orders are very important for authors.
They are.
So we are going to put that in the link, and we're excited for you, Stefanie, and all the very best.
Thank you. I really appreciate the support.